Yeah, the new cards this month are scary, and they're actually almost all different than the initial data mined versions we looked at previously. So we have a lot to discuss in this video. I'm going to cover each card in detail. I'm going to rate them each from 1 to 4 stars to lock in those predictions. And we're going to break down how some of these work, because we got some surprising details, for instance, on how War Machine is going to be totally busted, as we'll see, and talk about some other changes too. So let's kick things off here with the season pass card for the month. It's Hope Summers. And Hope Summers is a 3/4. After you play a card here, you get +1 energy next turn. Now, you may remember back in that initial data mine, we were freaking out because Hope Summers used to give +2 energy next turn, which just seemed like the craziest amount of ramp bundled into a card. I think she's gotten a little bit of a buff here up to 3/4, so slightly higher base power here, but only +1 energy cheat on those future turns. And the thing is, despite that effect being cut in half, I still actually think Hope Summers looks pretty dang good, and I don't think you have to do a lot to make this card crazy. And when I say a lot, you know, people are cooking up lists with things like Kitty Pride, for instance, where you're just playing that Kitty Pride every turn. You're getting that +1 energy. Kind of makes the Kitty Pride almost like free to weave in. You could put this alongside an Angela. You could put this alongside an Elsa Bloodstone, create that kind of lane where you're just dumping that extra power every single turn and not really losing any energy if you want to play on curve, because Hope is kind of making your Kitty Pride free. And don't get me wrong, that sounds awesome. That sounds like a really cool thing. You may not be able to assemble that perfect 4-card combo all the time, but just a couple pieces there, you're still going to get some nice scaling, some great bonus energy to work with. That's definitely going to create a nice little engine for a deck. I don't doubt that at all. But I think that's the kind of like crazy version, that's the all-in version on Hope. I think a perhaps safer way to use this card is in something like a ramp deck, where suddenly the ability to play multiple 6-cost cards in a row can have these really big advantages, right? So, you know, you play Hope on 3, you play whatever on 4, I don't care, just play it in Hope's location. You got 6 energy on turn 5, right? Slam down a big 6-drop. You could follow it up with another 6-drop, like an Artem Zola behind it or whatever, and boom, you've got a crazy turn that Hope enabled that otherwise wouldn't be possible to cheat out those double 6s. You know, could be Dr. Doom into Odin, could be a Null into an Artem Zola. I assume you've destroyed some stuff somewhere else along the way, right? There's all kinds of little possibilities that exist because of Hope Summer. Just even cheating 1 energy can really sort of break the curve and break opportunities open that wouldn't otherwise exist. I was thinking about this in like a Shuri deck, for instance. Play Hope into Shuri. Instead of having to play a 5-drop that's either a little too small, maybe like Vision, or with downside like Red Skull, just slam like a Magneto or something, right? You get an awesome 6-cost play. And then, of course, you could Taskmaster with some other things alongside it, right? Because you've got 7 energy on that final turn. So, you know, that's maybe not even the best examples, just 2 that come from top of mind. Basically, you don't have to go crazy and go turn after turn after turn to make Hope Summers worth it. Just a couple energy cheated over the course of a game can really add up to some big gains when you're cheating out significant cards or 2-card combos that wouldn't otherwise be possible. It just creates these moments and opportunities that otherwise wouldn't exist. So I think you do have the all-in, like I'm gonna go crazy getting tons of energy package possible off Hope Summers. I think you have just some like standard ramp sort of stuff that becomes possible with this card as well. And because of that, it seems like a flexible tool, man. I could see this going both more aggressive, both more big, and looks viable to me. And that 3/4 stat line, you know, is nice enough at a base that you're not really sacrificing much for this either. Could you even use this in a Surfer deck? I don't know. It's 3 costs, so the answer is always yes. Yes, you can. So moving on over to Pixie. This one also got some changes. Pixie is now a 2/1, where it was a 1/3 in the past, which felt, again, totally insane because that was just a premium stat line on an effect I thought you liked pretty well and came down on turn 1 as well, which was relevant because you get 1 extra draw out of this manipulation. Pixie's text has also changed since that initial version. Now it says shuffle the cost of all cards in your deck that started there. As I recall, that started there was not initially part of the card text, which does matter for things like a Thanos deck. You could have had Thanos stones being all of your low cost cards and then run a bunch of high cost cards and shuffle costs to get some one cost big stuff. So now maybe Thanos is not an easy out on this, but nonetheless, still run 1 drop, still run 0 drops for your Pixie, and then hopefully you get some big 6 drops pushed down to 0, and you cheat out a 0 cost Magneto, as the example in the reveal video provided, a 0 cost Blob, a 0 cost Goliath, whatever dreadful thing you want to conjure up with your Pixie becomes possible. Now, of course, when that happens, that also means you're going to have a 6 cost Wasp, because they swapped, right? So your Wasp is now going to cost 6, which is a dead draw, and you are going to probably create some weak draws in this deck. So like maybe half your draws are going to be awful, half your draws are going to be good. It is also noteworthy, of course, that cards can swap with other high cost things. So like 2 6 costs could swap and they won't have felt like they changed much at all. So it is going to be a bit of a mixed bag on the quality of draws. But if you play this on turn 2, of course, you're going to get quite a few draws to hopefully find that awesome stuff. You're also obviously going to have a few cards in hand as well that are not impacted by your Pixie at all. So basically, you're going to have this mix of like insane, cheap, awesome things in your deck, insanely terrible things in your deck, mediocre cards in hand that are just normal cards, right? They're going to feel fine. And then potentially also some mediocre cards in deck where the cost change maybe didn't really affect much or stayed the same or just shifted a point here or there or whatever. So it's just going to be a mixed bag. And what that means is some games you're going to get insanely good stuff, 2 or 3 draws in a row, and you're going to just absolutely run away with the game. Some games you might whiff and get some really bad stuff. And feel like you're just stuck. But when you have the luxury of snapping and playing your cubes around your draws, I think, even if it's on average, an average result, you're going to be able to invest your cubes in games where your results are favored, and back out and sacrifice games where you're unfavored and not risk any cubes. So, the cube system basically gives a card like this that otherwise might feel a little bit too chaotic. It gives you some decision points, which is really nice, and I think makes that actually rather powerful and becomes a pretty neat win condition of sorts. Now, one other thing I wanted to talk about with this card I haven't seen mentioned as much is that you can kind of force discounts on big stuff. So, I've seen everybody mentioning like 0 cost and 6 cost and 1 cost and 6 cost. What you could actually do instead is just have a couple really key big cards in your deck. For lack of a better example, I just used like Null and Arnim Zola together, right? So you could have like 2 big 6 drops, and then the rest of the deck is like all 3, for instance, or maybe 2s, 3s, whatever. It doesn't have to be completely staggered. So that if you have a 3 cost Zola and a 3 cost Null, they don't need to be 0 necessarily. You could run a bunch of other destroy stuff with them that's like 3 or less, as many destroy cards are, and then just guarantee yourself that, or again, it's not guaranteed because they could still technically roll each other, but more likely guarantee that you have some of that increased flexibility where you can cheat one of those out early, for instance, and make a big play out of it. If your Null, wants to be 3 costs, you can get it down early and then Zola it, and you got a cool play going. So I'm sure there are other great examples of that will come to mind for people. But in other words, sort of manipulating the cost and structure of the deck so that those big targets have more small things to hit, as opposed to kind of a 50-50 split of 0s and 6s, which might make things a little bit more chaotic. So in essence, there's a really cool deck building challenge for this, finding the right kind of structures for the different costs in your deck. Now, keep in mind, you also need a deck that's probably going to be functional when you don't hit Pixie, because you're not always going to hit this on turn 2. In fact, often you won't, which means, you need a deck that still kind of works when it whiffs. So that's another deck structure challenge to this as well. Now, ultimately, what does that mean? I think that means this is probably one of those cards in that like Mr. Negative space where good players, perfectly constructed decks can manipulate cube equity enough to make this feel really, really good. But I doubt it's one of those sort of tier 1 things. I was a little more confident when it was a 1-3. Now you're sacrificing a little bit more tempo. There's less ways to cheese it, perhaps. So I'm getting a little softer on this card over time as I think more and more about the consistency side of it. But I still think it will be one of those kind of off meta, side meta sort of decks that is viable to climb with for people who are dedicated, people who are really into it. Maybe just not sort of a top tier, super consistent meta deck, which probably a good thing. I don't think we want this much sort of high rolling and chaos in the meta every single day, but a viable card, a solid card, a build around card just not that tier 1 status probably. So next up here we have Cannonball, and this one got a big change, a big buff, I think. He's a 5/8. On reveal, move the highest power enemy card here away. If you can't, destroy it with a rock, and that means a rock takes its place when it gets destroyed. And the big change here is that this now is a soft target on the highest power enemy card. Before it was just a random card, which really made this feel like Stegron with extra steps. Like it did have some bonuses, of course, with rock stuff, but now this actually feels like a pretty cool targeted way to shift your opponent's most meaningful power around the board, which could be, you know, rather advantageous. There are like specific ways to manipulate that with like a lockdown deck. You know, you play Professor X in one location, they fill up a second one, you use Cannonball like on turn 6, for instance, launch their giant card into the Professor X, doesn't work, into the middle location or the filled location, doesn't work, and then, you know, it gets destroyed, and this just becomes a super powerful removal that always hits the biggest thing while still developing a lot of power itself, since this is 8, you know. So instead of using a Shang-Chi, slightly bigger way to gain stuff. You also have other manipulations like a Kingpin, for instance, where you're trying to send stuff into a Kingpin location so that it gets debuffed. Maybe that's another way. Or just knowing that you're gonna shift their biggest power around, and maybe that's beneficial to you in some way, kind of trying to manipulate certain locations. It could have risk, but if they just filled up one location anyway and you felt good about winning that one, you may not really care that their big threat gets destroyed. You might just care that it's sent to where they maybe already have like a bunch of power or whatever, and they're wasting it, and suddenly it's overkill, and it doesn't really matter to you if it gets destroyed or not. You just want to move it away from the key location the Cannonball is contesting. So just having more information, more decision points on how this is going to work goes, I think, a really long way. Also cool is that this just deletes the blob, because the blob has the text "can't be moved." This says if you can't move it, destroy it. So blob just gets wiped out totally by Cannonball, assuming he is the highest power enemy card, which obviously he usually is. In many cases he would be. So sort of a direct counter to blob, which blob isn't getting as much play these days, but still a little, and always something to keep in mind. An extra little step of relevance here for Cannonball. So, you know, does this mean that Cannonball gets played? You still need this sort of effect? I think it's iffy, right? We've seen some of these like move your opponent card packages with Kingpin and stuff. This does feel like a pretty interesting card in that space. There's also some lockdown stuff with like Professor X we talked about. Some interesting space there. Even things like clog decks, junk decks with debris and goblins and stuff. Some interesting space there as well, because if you're filling up your opponent's side of the board, then this gets a lot more efficient as a sort of removal card in those remaining places. So a few different angles for this one. It does sort of feel clunky at 5 mana. Like, how does that fit into all these different curves? You talk about Professor X, well, that's another 5 mana card. You're playing this on 6, you're floating a mana. What do you do with that 1 mana at the end? You know, little problems to solve like that become a bit of a check on this. But I do think this effect is now interesting enough that there are a few homes for it. Whereas in the past, this one felt a little clueless to me because of that random Stegron side of things. So major improvement, still maybe not the strongest card out there, but definitely some potential. So next up here, we have Mockingbird, and I think this one only had a minor text change since the data mine, but functionally looks the same. She's a 5/9, and she costs 1 less for each of your cards in play that didn't start in your deck. And I actually think this is really good. I don't know this is the most exciting compared to some of the other cards we've seen, but I think it actually is going to be really, really good. So as a shield themed card, of course, you could run this with other shield stuff, generating random cards in hand, discounting them with Quinjet, you know, buffing a collector, getting a big devil dinosaur, and using Mockingbird as another way to support some of those other threats in your deck. This is like a 1/9, a 0/9, or whatever. Obviously, that's incredibly efficient. You could even do things like Moon Girl to get multiple Mockingbirds and generate additional cards that didn't start in your deck, because Moon Girl copies, of course, even if they are cards that started in your deck, the copy did not start in your deck, so should, of course, discount Mockingbird. Those are all possibilities for this. I don't know that that kind of honest old school shield stuff holds up quite as well in modern metas. There is also Loki, which can contribute to that package a little bit and often does its own thing as well. Loki's kind of risky with Mockingbird because you'd have to top deck the Mockingbird after the Loki. Otherwise, the transformed cards off Loki, it's going to transform the Mockingbird as well, but not an impossibility if you wanted to take that flyer in a Loki deck. I don't think it'd be worth it, though. I think you just want more consistent stuff for Loki. So maybe not a shield line, but I don't think you need that. I think Thanos is actually the perfect home for Mockingbird because the stones don't start in your deck. They're shuffled into your deck at the beginning of the game. They don't start there. They're not in the collection manager when you build it. So every Thanos stone discounting Mockingbird while still doing awesome Thanos stuff, that's going to be insane. She's very quickly going to become a 2/9, a 1/9, a 0/9, which is a great complement in a Thanos deck that's already cycling through a bunch of cards anyway. So Mockingbird feels like an absolutely perfect, nutty sort of fit in Thanos and has some possibilities outside that as well. So just don't sleep on cards that are 1/9s or 0/9s or whatever. That is a really big number. Dodges Shang-Chi, gets crazy cheap, and you actually don't even need it to be. You play 2 cards. This is a 3/9. You're already pumped. A 4/9 is not bad either, for the record. So you don't even have to go crazy to make this feel good, and it can go crazy and can feel extra good, which is why I think this one's going to work really well. And then our final card might actually be the craziest of all based on some information we got on Twitter today. This is War Machine. He has not changed since the data mines at all. He's a 4/6 on reveal until the end of your next turn. Nothing can stop you from playing cards anywhere. And there was a bit of a debate when we first saw this, is like, how universal is that effect? Because, you know, we all know Jeff has that same sort of text. And in many cases, people were saying, hey, if it's like Jeff, it just means, you know, you can play it at locations. You can play it into Professor X. You can play it into a flooded location, whatever, right? It gives any card that base Jeff ability. But the next question was, does it negate the card text itself in hand for stuff like Ebony Maw or the Infinite, where the card is preventing itself from being played? Because Jeff doesn't really have that himself, right? So it was kind of a weird little question in people's minds. And it has been confirmed on Twitter today that the Infinite can't be stopped with War Machine. Ebony Maw can't be stopped with War Machine. That means if you play War Machine on turn 5, you can just slam an Infinite on turn 6. You don't have to skip your turn. You just get to play a 6/20. You can slam an Ebony Maw for that crazy 1/7 dump with War Machine. So this is actually kind of scary in that regard, because not only does this give you that Jeff angle where you can play in a Sanctum Sanctorum and win games outright because you had the War Machine and your opponent didn't, that is going to be a huge advantage. But you can also include these crazy threats in your deck that are also going to make your War Machine great in any game state, because suddenly you can just play a 6/20 without any of those restrictions or concerns. I could imagine a ramp deck actually playing both Infinite and Ebony Maw for 7 energy on a final turn thanks to War Machine. So that really opens up the space for this card. Basically, I had concerns that this maybe wasn't going to be useful enough if it was only an enabler for a lockdown deck that's like playing Storms, playing Professor X's, and this creates an opportunity for you to play your stuff into those locations, much like Jeff has used in those decks. It didn't necessarily feel as worth it, although it definitely felt possible. So now not only is that an angle, but a lot of decks could just run crazy big threats and use War Machine as just a piece of that puzzle, playing this out on turn 5 or like we said, turn 6 in a Magic game or something. And set up some of those monster dumps where, you know, Infinite's really good as a 6/20. That is a big 6-drop. That's going to win some locations. So yeah, that makes this card very intriguing, both utility and threat development. Now it does come at some downside. Obviously, like, this is not going to be the strongest turn 5 play, even if you weave it in with a 1-drop on turn 5. Like, clearly you're sacrificing a little bit, but you're hoping to make up for that with some cool downsides later. So there could definitely be games that feel like, oh, hey, they have War Machine. I lost because I can't contest the War Machine just because of location RNG lockdown stuff. And then there's going to be games where the War Machine signals an Infinite. Maybe there's nothing you can do about it anyway. So all in all, this card got a lot more intriguing with that confirmation. We know just how much this can do. And I think that doubles up on the sort of impact of this one, from both utility to also just output, and that helps a lot shore up some of the weaknesses I was concerned on for this one. So all that said, let's rate these cards from 1 to 4 stars and rank them from best to worst. Mockingbird is a 4-star card. War Machine is a 4-star card. Hope Summers is a 4-star card. Pixie is a 3-star card. Cannonball is a 2-star card. And there you go. That wraps it up for this month. Some of you might be like, oh man, you picked the most boring card as the number one, but I think Mockingbird's just boring and good. It's just clean, cheap, good stats, and that often wins more than build-arounds in Marvel Snap. But I think a lot of the cards this month are going to be good. Don't sleep on Pixie at 3 either. That's just kind of a consistency check on that score, but I think this will be a home run sometimes and feel crazy strong. So all in all, some good stuff. Cannonball, the weakest here, but I don't even hate him right now. Still not that bad. So, yeah, curious what you guys think. You excited for this month? Which cards you most excited to play? What do you think is going to be busted? I want to hear all those thoughts and more in the comments below. But until then, thanks much for watching. And until next time, game on.